Lucy, and hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you and to introduce you to uh, three remarkable gardens in Northern California. Each of these three gardens has a remarkable history, which I'll be sharing with you during this presentation. And that means that I'll be introducing you via photographs to some of the people who created these gardens, and I'll be showing you a couple of historic photographs as well. So the three Bay Area gardens that I'm going to talk about today truly are hidden gems that any garden lover will enjoy visiting. One is smack dab in the middle of San Francisco Bay. I'm sure you can guess which one that is. The second is in Saratoga on the peninsula. And the third one is in Walnut Creek in East Bay. Now, all three are open to the public, and I'll give you some contact information for each one at the end of each of these three stories. I just want to mention here, I want to mention here that something isn't going right, and I can't advance my slideshow.
Just click it.
I am clicking it.
Do the arrow on the bottom.
I usually am able to do this just by, there we go. Okay. I just want to mention here that all three of these gardens are featured in my book, The California Garden Tour, along with 47 other California gardens. And I wrote this book specifically because I wanted to introduce garden lovers to an array of incredible gardens that they can visit in California from San Diego all the way up to Mendocino. I've always been an advocate for garden tourism, which simply means adding gardens as part of your travel itinerary wherever you go. In my years as a travel writer, I came to realize that gardens, no matter how beautiful they were, how famous they were, simply were ignored in travel guides. And therefore, they were pretty much unknown to the public. But not only are these gardens dazzling and inspiring places to visit, they all provide a horticultural history lesson that ties us to a place and to an era and introduces us to all kinds of fascinating personalities and plants, of course. Now, of the three gardens that we're going to visit today, Alcatraz is probably the most startling and unexpected. So did you know that there are gardens at Alcatraz? Yes, there are, and they're surprisingly beautiful. And visiting them makes for a really special day trip because at times you might think that you're strolling on a lush Mediterranean isle instead of on the grounds of a former maximum security prison, which once housed the likes of Al Capone and Babyface Nelson. The Rock, as Alcatraz Island is known, is just that. It's a solid chunk of gray whack sandstone, probably 60 to 125 million years old, sitting in the middle of San Francisco Bay, about an hour and a half about a mile and a half from the shore. Now, what you may not know is that Alcatraz is also a national park. It's free and it's open year round, but the number of visitors is limited. So you do need to reserve as far in advance as you can if you want to visit it. Once you're on the island, you can explore the paths and the buildings that are open to the public. But if you want to see all the gardens, you must join one of the docent-led garden tours. Now, these are free tours. Before COVID, they were held every Friday and every Sunday at 9:45 a.m. Now they're held on Wednesdays and Thursdays, same time, but I'm going to give you a website that you can check to make sure that the garden tours are being held on whatever days they are being held now. COVID has put a wrench into so many things, as we all know. Okay, but first, of course, you have to get over to the island. And that requires a ferry ride from Pier 33 at Embarcadero and Bay Street in San Francisco. And the ferries run about every half hour starting at 9 a.m. But if you want to be on one of those garden tours, you'll have to reserve for one of the first two ferries in the morning, 9 or 9:30. And then you'll arrive here at the Alcatraz ferry landing. And this is where you'll meet your garden tour guide, or where you'll begin your own exploration of the island. And I want to mention here that even if you are unable to join one of the garden tours, you're really going to enjoy a visit to Alcatraz because you'll see many of the gardens anyway, okay? So you probably know that Alcatraz Island served as a federal penitentiary, and that period lasted from 1933 to 1963, 30 years. The island became a national park in 1972. It's part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. But what many people don't realize is that Alcatraz was not always a prison. And in fact, the island's story goes back to the earliest years of California statehood. In 1854, why is this not working? In 1854, the first lighthouse on the West Coast was erected on the island. And apparently, the very first garden was planted by the lighthouse keeper, although we have no record of that today. The tiered configuration that we see today, with a switchback road leading up to the top, was blasted out of the rock in the 1850s. And the island became a military fortification during the gold rush, the 1850s. And then it expanded during the Civil War, the 1860s. And at that time, houses were built for officers, and a citadel was built on the top that housed prisoners of war. Now, by the 1880s, in part because of an island beautification program, gardens were planted along the road and on the terraces and around the officers' houses, as well as at the topmost citadel. But gardening is obviously impossible on solid rock, so soil for all of these early gardens had to be hauled over from the mainland. Now, the gardens that you see on Alcatraz today were mostly planted during the island's 30-year prison era. And that's because of a guy named Fred Reichel, who was the warden's secretary. He took it upon himself to maintain the Victorian-style flower gardens left behind by the army. And he also obtained new plants that do well in Mediterranean climates. That was a very smart move. And he taught inmates how to build, plant, and maintain new gardens along the west side of the island. And we'll meet one of those inmates later on, at least his photograph. Now, when Alcatraz was decommissioned as a federal penitentiary in 1963, the gardens were abandoned. And of course, most of the flowers disappeared. But a few of the old roses that Reichel had cared for, and some of the Mediterranean plants that he'd obtained and that the inmates had planted were so tough that they survived for 40 years, and they're still blooming today. And they are called, appropriately enough, survivor plants. And about 230 of the approximately 600 plant species on Alcatraz are survivors. Now, from the ferry landing, most visitors continue up the slope towards the citadel. But if you're on one of the garden tours, you'll continue straight on and you'll get to enter the rose garden. Now, this garden was once filled with roses, obviously, planted by army families during the island's military era. And it was cared for by Fred Reichel after they left. And in 1989, the Heritage Rose Group came over to search for heirloom roses. And lo and behold, they found, and they took cuttings and they replanted about 15 rose species that had survived nearly 3 decades of complete neglect. And as it turned out, one of these roses was really quite rare. It's a survivor rose. It's a very fragrant pinkish red bourbon rose that was hybridized in France in the 1880s. And you'll still be able to see it growing on Alcatraz today. Now, in addition to the wonderful old roses, the rose garden is planted with colorful spring bulbs and an array of bright perennials. And one of the pleasures of a trip to visit the gardens of Alcatraz is that you get to enjoy some really remarkable and wonderful views. You know, you get to enjoy views of San Francisco and San Francisco Bay and Angel Island, which you see here. Now, when you leave the Rose Garden, you'll continue on this path, which winds up towards the Citadel at the top. And one level up, you'll come to Officers Row. And this is another garden area that you can enter only if you're on the garden tour. However, I want to tell you that you can look down on this garden from above, so you won't be unable to see it at all. You will be able to see it. And these sheltered gardens are filled with brilliant red pelargoniums and white calla lilies and springtime iris. They were created on the foundations of 3 large Victorian houses built in the 1860s for officers and torn down in 1941. And at the top there, you can see the empty shell of what was once the warden's house, which was in use until 1963. Now, this is one of the many surprisingly beautiful and atmospheric spots on Alcatraz. And standing here in the middle of San Francisco Bay with the city in the distance, you really do get a sense of what it must have been like for the Army officers and their families living on Alcatraz in the 19th century. And of course, for the prisoners who were incarcerated there later on. You know, it's incredibly scenic to our eyes, but once you're there, you also realize how very isolated it is. Now, when it became a national park in '72, the Park Conservancy consulted historic photographs and documentation because they wanted to restore the gardens, but they also use sustainable drought-resistant plants to approximate some of the original plant stock. And there's a whole group of park workers and volunteers who maintain the gardens today. Now, exploring, good heavens, I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of difficulty here. There we are. Exploring these gardens is just such a surprising and amazing experience. Even the towering foundation walls that rise up behind the flower-filled terrace seem to be telling tales. You know, they always remind me of the walls of a medieval European castle. And then near the top, you will come to the empty shell of the warden's house. And this area overlooks the parade ground down at shore level. And during spring nesting season, the parade ground is closed off to protect the western gulls, the snowy egrets, the brants, the cormorants, and the oyster catchers that make their home on the island and nest there every spring. Now, the gardens from this point on are mostly the work of 2 people in the 1940s and 1950s. One of them I've already mentioned, Fred Reichel. He's the one who took it upon himself to maintain the old Victorian gardens and who organized inmates to build, plant, and maintain new gardens. And one of those inmates was this fellow named Elliot Michener. Now, he was a counterfeiter who'd been moved from Leavenworth to Alcatraz. And Michener spent 8 years helping to build gardens on the west side of the island. It was part of yet another attempt to make the Rock look more appealing from San Francisco. And Elliot Michener was promoted to be the gardener of the warden's house, and eventually he was paroled. And the experience of gardening literally transformed this man's life, giving him, as he later said, a lasting interest in creativity. I really like that. Now, the gardens here along the West Road are open to all visitors. What makes this side of the island so remarkable is the lush assortment of succulents and that are planted along the exposed slopes here. So you're going to see big, bold agave attenuatas and a host of multi-hued sedums that create a really eye-popping display. And now I'm just going to breeze through about 4 slides to give you an idea of what you will see on this side of the island. There's one. Bring your cameras and your phones because it's very photogenic. Some truly beautiful plants to be seen there. The terraces below were planted by Elliot Michener and his inmate work crew. And here you'll find rambling roses and survivor fuchsias and apple, pear, and fig trees. Now, I'm not going to describe or show you any pictures of the cell block. I'm here to talk about gardens. And for me, the gardens at Alcatraz have a resonance that goes far beyond their obvious beauty. More than a century of gardening by employees and inmates has left a rich and I think very moving testament to the human need to connect with nature and to create beauty under even the harshest conditions. You know, it's not easy to turn a rock into a garden, but at Alcatraz, that's exactly what they did. So here is a bit of information about visiting Alcatraz. The one website that's probably most important here is alcatrazgardens.org. That will give you the most up-to-date information on when the garden tours are held. So do take a look at that before you make your plans to visit Alcatraz, okay? All right. So let's leave Alcatraz and head down the peninsula to visit another historic garden. This hidden gem is called Hakone Estate and Gardens, and it's nestled in the hills of Saratoga, about 50 miles south of San Francisco. Some call Hakone the second oldest Japanese garden in the United States. But if we are talking about Japanese gardens created by the Japanese, in other words, a Japanese architect and landscape designer, Hakone is actually the oldest Japanese garden in the Western Hemisphere. Hakone is a rare treasure in more ways than one. That this historic Japanese garden survives at all is a testament to a collective garden-loving spirit that has kept it alive and growing for over a century. It's gone through many hands and modes of support and maintenance in the 100+ years that it's been around. And recently, the National Trust of Historic Preservation selected Hakone as one of 12 sites in the US to receive their Save America's Treasures Award. Now, you may be wondering at this point, or maybe you're not wondering, but I'm going to tell you anyway, what and where the oldest Japanese or Japanese style garden in the US is or was. And here's the answer. The oldest Japanese style garden in the US is the 5-acre Japanese tea garden in Golden Gate Park. It was originally part of a Japanese village exhibit built for the 1894 California Midwinter International Exposition. But it was not built by the Japanese. It was built by an Australian businessman named George Marsh, who had lived in Japan and who was fascinated by Japanese culture. Now, keep in mind that most Westerners at that time had never seen this kind of Japanese tea garden. And it became so popular, such a novelty, that when the exhibition ended, the city of San Francisco decided to retain the tea garden that had been such a success with visitors, and it has been altered and added to over the years, but you can still visit the historic Japanese tea garden in Golden Gate Park, and I hope you will the next time you're in San Francisco. It's certainly worth a visit. Now let's fast forward from 1894 to 1915 and the Panama Pacific Exposition, which was held in post-earthquake San Francisco. This World's Fair featured another Japanese garden, and a Japanese pavilion. And as at the 1894 event in Golden Gate Park, this pavilion and garden became one of the most popular exhibits at the fair. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore. But a very wealthy patron of the arts named Isabel Stein visited this exposition, and she was so enthralled by the Japanese garden that she decided to create a similar garden on the 18 acres that she and her husband Oliver had purchased in Saratoga. So Isabel Stein was a woman of means. She sailed to Japan. She spent a year there just looking at various garden estates, especially those in Hakone National Park. She then hired a Japanese architect, Tsunamatsu Shintani, and a Japanese landscape designer, Naoharu Aihara, to help realize her plans. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't find a photo of either of those gentlemen, but they are the actual creators responsible for Hakone. And given the rising tide of anti-Japanese sentiment in California at the time, Isabel Stein's hiring of Shintani and Aihara, well, it really was a gesture of cross-cultural goodwill. And that continues to be the mission carried on today by the Hakone Foundation. In 1917, Mr. Aihara set about creating a hill and pond garden. This was a style popular in 17th century Japan, and it was well suited for the Steins' hillside property. Mr. Shintani designed the beautiful wooden moon viewing pavilion that sits on the hillside with a veranda overlooking the garden below. And this ensemble of house above and garden below is the original garden composition from 1917. So here you are looking at the oldest Japanese garden in the Western Hemisphere. I think that's pretty remarkable. Tightly pruned shrubs and a tall Hinoki cypress spruce, a tree often used in bonsai, add to the sculptured look of the scene. 3 stone lanterns and large carved and natural rocks are carefully sited around the pond as additional focal points. And this small waterfall adds movement to the ensemble of garden and buildings. Now, there have been several modifications and additions to the garden over the years. There's now a camellia garden behind this pavilion, and there's a wisteria arbor to one side of it. And if you time your visit for April this month, when the wisteria is blooming, you're in for a true photogenic treat. And unfortunately, I could not time my visit for April, so I don't have a shot of that beautiful wisteria to share with you. I'm sorry. Now, like all Japanese gardens, the hill and pond style is meant to encourage gentle strolling and reflection and viewing of the garden landscape in every season and from many different perspectives and at different times of the day and night. And specific structures and areas within the garden are used for viewing the moon in its many phases. Now, this is the moon bridge. It's an integral part of the garden's compositional design. This type of arched pedestrian bridge originated in China, and it was used on canals because the shape of it allowed barges to pass beneath. A moon bridge is always placed so that its reflection can be seen in still water, and the high arch and its reflection form a circle or a semicircle, which symbolizes the moon. Now at Hakone, the moon bridge spans a koi pond, and it also has a small turtle-shaped island in that pond. And the turtle in Japanese culture is a symbol of longevity. The Steins, gee, I've got all these things on, I can't see this. Sorry, I'm having a little mess up here. There we go. The Steins did not live in the moon viewing pavilion, which is where I'd like to live, but in the 3-bedroom lower house built in 1922. It's now used as an event space, and you'll find a small Zen garden there. And then in 1932, the property was sold to Major C.L. Tilden, and he added to the garden by putting in this impressive main gate. And it was probably because Major Tilden owned the place that Hakone made it through World War II, a time when Japanese Americans were incarcerated in camps, and many beautiful Japanese gardens were unfortunately destroyed. Now, eventually, the property was sold to the city of Saratoga for use as a county park, and the Hakone Foundation was formed to take over the garden maintenance and to turn the park into an Asian American cultural center. In 1987, Kiyoshi Yashui, a 14th generation architect to the Japanese imperial family, was brought over to oversee the installation of a new bamboo garden. And this hillside garden is planted, obviously, with several varieties of bamboo, including this rare and I think very beautifully colored tortoiseshell bamboo from Japan. Now, in addition to designing the bamboo garden, Kiyoshi Yashui oversaw the construction of a new cultural exchange center in the 1990s. And this building, like the moon viewing pavilion, was built in Japan using pegs instead of nails and reassembled on the site. It's modeled after a traditional Japanese merchant's house. And if you do visit Hakone, do be sure to spend some time looking at the very interesting exhibits about the history of the garden and some of the events that have taken place there. For instance, opera lovers, take note, the West Coast premiere of Puccini's opera Madama Butterfly took place at Hakone under the sponsorship of Isabel Stein. And then several decades later, Hakone was used as one of the settings in the 2005 movie Memoirs of a Geisha. You can spend some time hanging out on the lovely deck behind the Cultural Exchange Center. There are some very pretty views of the verdant hills around Silicon Valley. Well, you know, every garden has a history. Every garden has many stories to tell, and Hakone certainly has more than its share. So as you head back toward the main gate, just pause and take another look at this peaceful scene that has charmed and inspired visitors for over 100 years now. It's still there to enjoy thanks to the garden lovers who have treasured this living treasure. Here's a bit of information if you want to visit Hakone. Really, all you need to take away here is the website hakone.com. It will give you all of the information, the most up-to-date information that you need for visiting. Okay. So now let's leave the soft tranquility of Hakone and go visit our last garden, an entirely different kind of garden. This one is located across the Golden Gate Bridge in East Bay. It always amazes me when I find an extraordinary garden hidden away in an otherwise unassuming residential neighborhood or location. And that is the case with the Ruth Bancroft Garden. It's located in Walnut Creek, which is a very affluent and well-heeled suburban enclave about 25 miles east of San Francisco. But you could drive right by the Ruth Bancroft Garden and never know the treasures that it contains. They have gone through some big changes in the past few years, though, which has increased the garden's visibility. They recently built this new visitor center and nursery. And all of this is good news to me because I think that this garden is one of the great gardens of Northern California, and it should be recognized as such. You know, I spent quite a long period of time, let's just say years, visiting all the gardens in my 2 garden tour books and researching their history and the people who created them. And I've always been struck by the longevity of so many gardeners' lives. Now, here's Ruth Bancroft, who created this garden. And Ruth lived to be 109 years old. Count them, 109. And I'm not saying you're going to live to be 109 if you go out and start working in your garden immediately. But I think there is definitely a connection between being an active gardener, connected to the earth, and living a long, satisfying life. Now, during her lifetime, Ruth Bancroft gained international recognition for her pioneering work in horticulture. Her garden demonstrates that a dry garden in the heart of a busy urban inland corridor can be lush and diverse and striking in design. And her garden was actually the inspiration for the founding of the Garden Conservancy in 1989. Now, if you haven't heard of the Garden Conservancy, it's a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving private gardens for public use, and the Ruth Bancroft Garden was its first preservation project in 1992. This jewel box of a garden occupies a very small portion of what was once a 400-acre walnut and pear farm founded in the 1880s by Hubert Bancroft. He was a very well-known historian and publisher, and his collection of Western history formed the basis for the very famous Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley. And Ruth Peterson, the force behind this very special garden, grew up in Berkeley. She became a teacher, and when she was 31, she married Philip Bancroft Jr., Hubert Bancroft's grandson, and she moved to this house on the Bancroft farm in Walnut Creek. Now, she'd always been a fairly traditional gardener, kind of in the Gertrude Jekyll cottage garden vein. But sometime in the 1950s, she bought a potted Iconium. And, well, I don't know how to say this any other way. She simply fell in love with succulents. And she started to collect and grow them in 1-gallon pots in her lath house. Then in 1971, her husband, Phil, sold the last of the old walnut orchards, but he retained 3.5 acres, and he presented this parcel to Ruth so she could create an entirely new garden. And she jumped at the chance. She was in her 60s, and this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to create something really unique, a dry garden focused on drought-tolerant succulents and cacti with palm trees thrown in for good measure. So she hired a local plantsman to help her plan the planting beds and layout of the garden. And they trucked in, tons of crushed rock and gravel to loosen up the heavy alluvial soil and to create mounted planting beds. So here you're seeing a photo of her garden in its very infancy. When you walk through the garden, you won't see edging of any kind. It's not an entirely naturalistic landscape, but it works as an artful way to group and display and contrast the size, texture, form, and color of different plants. There is something blooming year-round, blooming or fruiting year-round in this garden. The cacti and succulents typically display brilliantly colored flowers and interesting fruits. The trees, many of them are rare exotics, add another layer of interest to the desert meets tropics landscape, and they provide some much needed shade during the hot summer and autumn months. Ruth Bancroft planted for visual appeal rather than by scientific, family, or geography. This photograph illustrates that very well. There are, for example, several different aloe genuses planted around the garden. Most of them come from rocky slopes on the Arabian Peninsula and in Africa, but there are aloes from Saudi Arabia, from northern Yemen, Ethiopia, and Eritrea and South Africa. And each one of them has different colored leaves and spectacular flower stalks and fruits. This is my little garden of horrors shot for you. some of the plants can look, well, let's face it, quite sinister, like they're about to bite your hand off. But you'll certainly come away with a new respect, perhaps fear, for the sheer diversity and the beauty of succulents and cacti. There's an excellent self-guided tour book, guidebook available in the visitor center that will direct you to all the botanical wonders and rarities to be seen in this intriguing and very entertaining garden. It almost feels at times like you're visiting another planet with incredibly different plant forms. So the following few slides will just give you an idea of some of the plants that you will encounter at the Ruth Bancroft Garden. If I can find my advance here. There we are. One. Again, bring your camera and your phone to take photos because it's extremely photogenic, this garden. That huge agave, quite remarkable. Most of the trees in this garden come from other tropical or desert countries, and many of them are endangered in their native lands. But these giant California fan palms, Washingtonia foliifera, are the only palm trees native to the Western US. Now, I've only had time to show you a few of the many extraordinary plants on view in this compact but artfully designed garden. It has a richness that, it just leaves you dazzled and delighted. You come away with a smile. And just as a reminder, the Ruth Bancroft Garden was the very first garden recognized by the Garden Conservancy as a unique American garden worth preserving and protecting. Here's a bit of information for you. All you really need to know is ruthbancroftgarden.org. Again, it will give you all of the information that you need to plan your visit. So I hope that the next time you're in the Bay Area, you will include a visit to one or two or perhaps all three of these hidden gems. And I hope that you'll make garden visits a regular part of your travel itinerary wherever you go. My 2 garden tour books cover all the great public gardens, large and small, on the West Coast, from San Diego all the way up to the northern tip of Vancouver Island, British Columbia. As you know, we are blessed with an amazing assortment of public gardens out here. And you'll find 110 of them in my 2 garden tour books. And to me, wherever I travel, visiting a local park or garden is as essential as visiting a museum. Well, for me, it is visiting a museum because I regard gardens as living museums. Museums that demonstrate the cooperation between humans and nature. And in these very stressful times that we are living in, you all know what I mean, visiting a garden or a park can provide us with some much needed moments or hours of peace and tranquility and wonder and beauty and, yes, even joy. So keep your gardens growing, support your local gardens, and happy garden touring to each and every one of you. Bye now, and thank you.